Our young soldiers saw service away from this land. They served with General Gordon in Egypt and in the Boer War. When the First World War was declared, Indian, Métis, and our Inuit brothers enlisted as volunteers. Joe Daniels volunteered, so did Private Martin and Private Buck. Corporal Francis Pegamagabo, the most decorated Indian soldier of the First World War. Olympic athlete Tom Longboat, and Private Norwest, who never came home.
There's a moment at the start of the First World War that doesn't quite fit the story we think we know. August 1914. Britain declares war, and Canada follows automatically. No debate, no vote, just war. The sound carries fast. Bugles in Halifax, crowds in Montreal, recruitment lines forming in Toronto and Vancouver. But the call doesn't stop there. It travels farther, into the north, across the plains of the Blood Reserve in Alberta, through the forests of Six Nations in Ontario. And that's where the story becomes complicated. Because the men hearing that call weren't citizens. Under the Indian Act, they were wards of the state. They couldn't vote, couldn't freely leave their reserves, in many cases needed permission just to exist beyond its boundaries, and yet, when the call came to fight for Canada, they answered, in numbers that should make us stop and ask why. We have to ask that question that sits at the very heart of this story. Why go? Why volunteer to fight for a country that denied your citizenship? Why risk everything for an empire that had already taken so much? Was it loyalty? Economic necessity? A sense of warrior responsibility? Or something more complex, something shaped by treaty, by kinship, by strategy, or by survival? Today's episode explores that contradiction, not through abstraction, but through people. Snipers who moved like ghosts through no man's land, runners who carried messages under fire with nothing but speed and resolve, men whose bravery was celebrated overseas, yet quietly sidelined when they came home. This is not a story about symbols or stereotypes. It's a story about choice, pressure, and consequence, and it begins in a country that asked Indigenous men to fight for it before it was willing to call them citizens. Welcome to the 21st episode of Memory and Valour, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the individual stories and quiet sacrifices of Canadian veterans. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. If you value history that goes beyond the headlines and into the human experience of war, follow Memory and Valour wherever you listen to your podcast. Before we get started, I'm just going to take a moment to let you guys know that I have acquired what appears to be the Great Plague of 2026, and so my voice is not quite what it should be, but here we are. The show must go on. By the time the armistice was signed, more than 4,000 Indigenous men had enlisted in Canada. In some communities, nearly every eligible man between 18 and 45 signed up. Why? For some, maybe it was the warrior ethos, a chance to reclaim a tradition of bravery that the reserve system had tried to stifle. For others, maybe it was simpler. Steady paycheck of $1.10 a day to send home to families struggling in poverty. But for many, there was a sophisticated political hope. They believed that if they shed their blood on the world stage along the British Crown, the Canadian government would be forced to recognize them as equals when the smoke cleared. They were fighting two wars, one against the Kaiser and one for their own dignity. At first, the Canadian government was actually hesitant. There were concerns about how status Indians would be treated if captured by the Germans, and some officials worried about primitive soldiers in a modern, mechanized war. Primitive is in quotes, of course. They couldn't have been more wrong. As the first contingent formed, men began to travel hundreds of miles by canoe, horseback, and foot just to reach an enlistment office. You have to understand that In 1914, what were known then and still are on paper as Indian reserves were often quite far removed from urban centers. So when we say that some men went on foot and traveled on foot through the prairie to get to a recruiting center, it's true. We see names appearing on the rolls that would soon become legendary. Men like Francis Pegamegabo from the Wasauksing First Nation, who didn't want to be asked. He was among the very first to sign up in August 1914. In Newfoundland, not yet part of Canada, Inuit men like John Shiwak were leaving the trapping lines of Labrador to join the Newfoundland Regiment. In the West, the 49th Battalion out of Edmonton was beginning to see faces of men like Alex Decoteau, a Cree runner who was already a local hero as a police officer. These men weren't just soldiers. They were hunters, scouts, and athletes. They brought with them a set of skills, patience, navigation, and marksmanship that the mighty, static nightmare of the Western Front desperately needed. But as the troop ships pulled away from the docks in Quebec, these men were leaving behind a country that didn't yet know how to value them. They were headed toward a conflict that would test their bodies and their spirits in ways no hunting trip ever could. So in this episode, we're going to go into the mud of the front lines to meet the two most feared marksmen in the British Empire, the ghosts of the trenches, Henry Norwest and Francis Pegamegabo. By early 1915, the Western Front had stopped moving. The war had settled into a strange new reality. It was one where survival depended not on strength or speed, but on patience. The trenches created a battlefield where soldiers learned to look constantly, yet understand almost nothing of what they were seeing. The land between the lines, no man's land, was a place where visibility didn't mean safety, and stillness was often the difference between life and death. It was in this environment that the Army came to rely on a particular kind of soldier. Official paperwork called them snipers, observers, and scouts. The men at the front had a simpler term. They called them ghosts. Survival depended on men who could look without being seen, and so out there between the lines, Indigenous soldiers gained a reputation that spread quietly and quickly. One of the most feared was Henry Norwest. Norwest was born in May 1884 in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, which is probably about a 20-minute car ride north of Edmonton. He was a Métis man of Cree descent. Before the war, he lived on what was then known as the Hobbema Reserve. It's now known by its proper name of Musqueam, which is Cree for Bear Hills, and that sits about maybe an hour's drive south of the city of Edmonton. So roughly about 100 kilometers south of Fort Saskatchewan total. He worked as a ranch hand, a saddle maker, and a rodeo performer. And for a short time, he actually served with the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, a background that would shape both his discipline and his reputation. Though, his entry into the war was not very smooth. In January 1915, he enlisted under the name Henry Louis, joining the 3rd Canadian Mounted Rifles. 3 months later, he was discharged, officially for drunkenness. For many Indigenous and Métis men, those rules were enforced more harshly and forgiveness was offered less freely. Norwest didn't walk away. On September 8, 1915, he enlisted again, this time in Calgary under the name Henry Norwest. He openly declared his prior service and was accepted into the Canadian Expeditionary Force, assigned service number 435684, and posted to the 50th Battalion of the Canadian Infantry, Alberta Regiment. He arrived in France in August 1916. Somewhere along the way, and this is fairly well known, common knowledge, he acquired the nickname Ducky. It didn't come from the battlefield, but more of a moment of, some say, gentle embarrassment. Apparently on leave in London, he reportedly explained to his comrades that he had to duck the attention of the women there, and the name stuck. Some accounts say that he would have a lot of women on the go at the same time, and so he'd be ducking out on them. Regardless, again, it said something important. Even the most feared sniper in the battalion was, off the line, basically human. Norwest was soon promoted in the field to Lance Corporal. not for ambition, but out of necessity. He had found the role the war required of him. Sniping was not about aggression, it was about restraint. Norwest was adept at camouflage, using foliage, shadow, and terrain so completely that fellow soldiers sometimes lost track of where he'd gone. He often remained motionless in shell holes for 2 days and nights at a time, surviving on little more than a biscuit and water. He used a rifle fitted with a telescopic lens, and he was known to never fire unless he was certain he could not be seen. At night, he sometimes crossed enemy lines entirely, waiting until the early hours to take a single shot. Officially, Henry Norwest is credited with 115 fatal shots, all witnessed, all recorded. The Army only counted what could be confirmed. Everyone understood that the real number was higher. German prisoners later confirmed what Canadian soldiers already believed. Norwest was known by name on the other side and feared. In April 1917, during the fighting at Vimy Ridge, Norwest earned the military medal for his actions after the capture of a key position known as the Pimple near Ypres. His citation praised his, quote, great bravery, skill, and initiative in sniping the enemy, noting that his work saved a great number of our men's lives, end quote. In 1918, he was awarded a bar to that medal for gallantry in the field, a second military medal. Only about 830 men out of more than 600,000 Canadians who served achieved that distinction. Yet those who served with him remembered something deeper than skill. One fellow soldier wrote, quote, our famous sniper no doubt understood better than most of us the cost of life and the price of death. Henry Norwest carried out his terrible duty superbly because he believed his special skill gave him no choice but to fulfill his indispensable mission. Yet when we had the rare opportunity to see our comrade at close quarters, we found him pleasant and kindly, quite naturally one of us, and always an inspiration, end quote. On August 18, 1918, 3 months before the armistice, Norwest and 2 others were searching for a nest of enemy snipers near Fouquetcourt. A single German bullet struck him, killing him instantly. He was 34 years old. In what soldiers remembered as an act of rare respect, Major General Arthur Currie reportedly ordered every available artillery gun in the sector to fire on enemy positions, a tribute to one of the British Empire's most effective sharpshooters. Norwest comrades buried him near where he fell. On his first temporary grave marker, they wrote a line that says as much about battlefield respect as it does about loss. It said, it must have been a damn good sniper that got Norwest. Henry Norwest, son of Mrs. Genevieve Norwest of Sacred Heart, Alberta, never came home. He is remembered today on a marker at Fort Saskatchewan Cemetery in Alberta, but he is buried overseas at Warvillers Churchyard Extension in France. For him, there was no reintegration, no public campaign, and no platform from which to speak. Francis Pegamegabo would come home. And while history often groups them together as snipers, as Indigenous soldiers, as extraordinary marksmen, their post-war paths could not have been more different. Norwest's war ended in the mud. Pegamagabo's would follow him home. Francis Pegamagabo was born in March 1891 on the Perry Island First Nation on Georgian Bay. He was Anishinaabe, raised in a community shaped by water, forest, and movement. From a young age, he learned skills that did not translate neatly into enlistment forms, but mattered profoundly once the war began. Things like tracking, marksmanship, and endurance, and an intuitive ability to read land others saw as empty. When Francis Pegamagabo enlisted, he did so at the very beginning of the war, before anyone really understood what it would become. On September 15, 1914, Pegamagabo attested at Valcartier, Quebec, the massive training camp hastily assembled north of Quebec City to process Canada's first wave of volunteers. His service number was 6846, placing him among the earliest men to join the CEF. He was posted to the 1st Battalion, Canadian Infantry, part of the 1st Canadian Division that sailed for Britain later that fall. At that moment, the Canadian Army was still fighting an imagined war, meaning we as Canadians weren't really there yet. I mean, the PPCLI was there, but the CEF wasn't there yet. Training emphasized drill, discipline, and obedience, tight formations, clear chains of command, and strict adherence to orders. The assumption was that modern war could be controlled through structure. Individual initiative was not particularly valued, and certainly not taught. The Western Front had a way of dismantling assumptions. The early battles, especially Second Ypres in 1915, made it brutally clear that rigid thinking was a liability. Remember, Second Ypres in the spring of 1915 was the battle when the Germans first used gas, and in this case it was chlorine gas. Trench warfare transformed the battlefield into a place where enemies were often unseen but devastatingly accurate. So survival now depended on observation, timing, and individual judgment. Armies needed men who could operate independently in dangerous, uncertain spaces, forward of the main lines. And this is where the Army began to adapt. By late 1915 and into 1916, scouts and snipers became essential. Much of their work took place in no man's land, the contested strip between opposing trenches that shifted daily under shell fire and rifle shot. Scouts sent forward into this space were expected to locate enemy positions, identify new trench lines or machine gun nests, guide artillery fire, and disrupt German operations without drawing attention to themselves. It was labor done in silence, often at night or just before dawn, and it demanded patience rather than speed, restraint rather than aggression, and a willingness to act without supervision or recognition. Pegamagabo proved himself in these roles through consistency rather than spectacle. He moved carefully, memorizing the shape of the land and the rhythms of the opposing lines. His patrols returned with reliable information, details about troop movements, supply routes, and defense weaknesses that could be verified once an attack began. His observations held up under fire, which mattered in an environment where bad intelligence cost lives within minutes. So over time, officers noticed a pattern. When Pegamagabo reported what he'd seen, artillery adjustments made sense. Raids landed where he said they would. German counterattacks came from the directions he had predicted. Trust like that was rare on the Western Front, where confusion, fear, and misinformation were constant companions. As a result, Pegamagabo was increasingly sent forward of the trenches, operating alone or with minimal support. He served both as a scout and a sniper, roles that demanded trust more than rank. So sniping was not simply about marksmanship, it required hours of stillness, the ability to remain unseen, and careful judgment about when not to fire. Talk about control, especially in an environment like that. Scouting required the same discipline, combined with acute observation and an understanding of how information would be used by commanders far behind the lines. By the later years of the war, Pegamagabo had become part of a small group of soldiers relied upon to do work that sort of sat outside formal orders and rigid structures. His effectiveness lay not in bravado, but in reliability, an earned reputation that allowed him a degree of independence unusual for an Indigenous private in a colonial army. Francis Pegamagabo's effectiveness as a scout and sniper has often been linked to his upbringing as an Ojibwe hunter. That connection is real, but it needs to be handled carefully. He did not arrive on the Western Front with mystical knowledge or pre-modern techniques that suddenly outmatched industrial warfare. What he brought instead were habits of attention that translated unusually well to the environment of trench war. Traditional subsistence hunting emphasized patience, concealment, and close observation of surroundings. Success depended on reading subtle signs, so disturbed ground, altered silence, habitual movement, rather than speed or aggression. These skills were learned gradually and reinforced through experience, not instinct. Pegamagobo applied these same habits to the battlefield, where survival likewise depended on noticing small changes in a dangerous landscape. This didn't make him fundamentally different from other effective soldiers. Many experienced hunters from rural backgrounds, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, adapted well to reconnaissance and sniping. What distinguished Pegamagobo was consistency. He maintained discipline under exhausting conditions and prolonged exposure, where fear, noise, and fatigue caused many soldiers to lose situational awareness. His restraint, knowing when not to move and when not to shoot, mirrored hunting practice but was applied in a modern military context. So Henry Norwest, the Métis sniper, provides an important comparison. So like Pegamagobo, Norwest had extensive pre-war experience as a hunter and marksman. Like Pegamagobo, he didn't rely on constant fire, but on selective engagement and careful positioning. Norwest was known for his deliberate pace and his refusal to shoot unless conditions were ideal. He emphasized concealment and often remained forward of the main line, exposing himself to danger for extended periods. His reputation mirrored Pegamagobo's, not flamboyant, not reckless, but dependable. And he was killed in 1918 while conducting such work, a reminder that even the most disciplined approach carried persistent risk. The success of both men highlights a broader truth. Their effectiveness came not from individual background alone, but from how those backgrounds intersected with a moment in military adaptation. So Pegamagobo's sniping cannot be reduced to either Indigenous tradition or military training alone. It existed at the intersection of both. His upbringing shaped how he observed and waited. The war dictated where and why those skills were used. Compared with British and German doctrine, his approach aligned most closely with the Canadian shift toward flexible, intelligence-driven warfare. Together with Norwest, Pegamagobo demonstrates how effectiveness on the Western Front often depended less on formal rank or doctrine than on disciplined judgment under pressure. Their success offers a useful corrective to heroic myths about snipers. In wartime memory, Norwest's impact is often framed around exceptional sniping skill cut short by death. He represents the archetype of the elite sniper whose career ends in the line of duty. His story reinforces the dangers and the costs of such specializations. Pegamagobo's post-war impact extends beyond battlefield performance. He survived the war and became a symbol, though not a comfortable or simplistic one, of Indigenous service and sacrifice. His later activism highlighted the gap between wartime contribution and peacetime treatment of Indigenous veterans.
People were desperate in a lot of areas, no jobs, and the trapping was poor. So they were out to go someplace where they can make a living, get 3 meals a day, and they were also very proud when they put on that uniform.
It was my duty. I even thought maybe it was more my duty than anybody else. I had just as much right, more right to fight than anybody else because I was Indian. This was my country.
So in this way, his impact continued long after the armistice, shaping how Canadians have revisited the war and its social consequences. Norwest and Pegamagobo were equally lethal, disciplined, and respected, but they mattered in different ways, and together they show us that success on the Western Front was not defined by a single role or measure. One shaped the battlefield moment by moment. The other helped shape how the battle was understood, fought, and later remembered. By war's end, Pegamagobo would hold a distinction almost unmatched in the Canadian forces. The military medal with 2 bars, awarded for repeated acts of bravery under fire. Only a handful of men in the entire CEF would receive the same. But here's where Pegamagobo's story diverges. Unlike Norwest, he survived, and survival gave him something dangerous. It gave him a voice. When he returned home, Pegamagobo did not fade quietly into civilian life. He didn't accept medals as closure. Instead, he looked at the distance between how Indigenous soldiers had fought overseas and how Indigenous people were still treated at home, and he refused to ignore it. For many Indigenous veterans, the war ended with a hard landing. They returned to reserves governed by the Indian Act, where movement, political organization, and land use remained tightly controlled. Some were denied the veterans' benefits they'd been promised. Others found their reserve lands reduced or reassigned while they were overseas. The respect earned on European battlefields dissolved almost immediately upon arrival back in Canada. Pagamagabo took this personally, but not privately. In the years after the war, he became increasingly involved in community leadership. He was elected chief of the Wasuking Perry Island First Nation, a role he held for several terms during the 1920s and 1930s. As a chief, he dealt with issues that had nothing to do with warfare, but everything to do with survival. Land encroachment, access to resources, government interference in band governance, and the erosion of treaty rights. His approach was direct and often confrontational. He challenged federal Indian agents who exercised near total authority over reserve life. He protested restrictions on fishing and hunting that criminalized Indigenous livelihoods. And he objected to policies that framed Indigenous people as wards rather than citizens. Here, his wartime experience mattered. Pagamagabo understood bureaucracy, hierarchy, and authority, but he also understood how brittle those structures became when faced with someone who refused to back down. He had navigated command structures abroad. He now applied the same confidence at home. And this didn't make him popular with the federal officials. Pagamagabo's activism extended beyond his own community. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, he became involved in what would become the League of Indians of Canada, one of the country's first national Indigenous political organizations, founded by Mohawk leader Frederick Ogilvie Law. The League sought to unite Indigenous nations across Canada, and they wanted to push for recognition of treaty rights, an end to forced enfranchisement, greater control over education and land, and the right to organize politically without government interference. Indigenous veterans were often among the most vocal critics of colonial policy. They had fought for the empire, absorbed its rhetoric of duty and sacrifice, and returned home unwilling to accept second-class status. Pagamagabo argued that Indigenous soldiers had proven their loyalty and capability under fire, and that this made continued paternalism impossible to justify. In effect, he turned Canada's own wartime logic back on itself. But Canada refused, and this refusal came at a cost. Pagamagabo's outspokenness strained his relationships with officials and even within his own community. Leadership was exhausting, and post-war life offered none of the clear objectives or recognition that the Army, however imperfectly, had provided. Like many veterans, he struggled. His post-war years were not a simple story of triumph or moral clarity. They were uneven, difficult, and human. But what defines this period is not failure, it's persistence. Pagamagabo didn't retreat into silence, and he didn't trade resistance for comfort. Where Henry Norwest's story ends on the battlefield, cut short, unseen, and unchallenged, Pagamagabo's continues into the uncomfortable terrain of political confrontation. And when the guns finally fell silent, he redirected his same resolve, independence, and refusal to be underestimated toward this different fight, one that would last the rest of his life, and one Canada is still reckoning with today.
That was not our war. We volunteered to go because we want to look after our land.
In the 1st Battalion, his reputation was almost supernatural. Private Terrell, a fellow soldier, wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Peggy, as he was known to his mates, was a law unto himself. He would go out at night and bring back souvenirs from German trenches. He seemed to have a sense that told him when a shell was coming or where a sniper was hiding," end quote. But Pagamagabo's war was also a spiritual one. He often spoke of the spirit power that guided him. He wrote later about his experiences, quote, "When I was at the front, I would sometimes feel a presence, something that told me to move or to stay still. I believe my medicine pouch kept the bullets away," end quote. Now, he wore a medicine pouch around his neck for the entirety of that war, and he came home. Despite being gassed at Ypres and wounded multiple times, he kept returning. He didn't just hunt, he captured. In one single action, he ran into a German trench, captured 30 men, and brought them back to Canadian lines. An anonymous Indigenous veteran later reflected on this duality in a post-war interview. Quote, "In the woods, you hunt to eat. In the trenches, you hunt so your friends don't die. But the eyes, you never forget the eyes of the man who didn't see you coming." End quote. All right, we're going to shift our focus now, this time to the 49th Battalion, the Edmonton Regiment. And as you all know, that's where I hail from, is Edmonton, Alberta. For Albertans, this unit occupies a particular place in memory. Raised on the prairies, its ranks were filled with farmers, laborers, police officers, athletes, men accustomed to endurance, not ease. When they arrived in France in late 1915, they carried that prairie toughness into one of the most punishing environments modern war had yet produced. Their war diary entries are often sparse, almost understated. Mud, wire, shelling, casualties. But within those clipped notes were movements of extraordinary human strain, especially for those whose job required them to leave the relative safety of the trench. In a war that depended on coordination, communication was everything. And yet, telephone wires were constantly obliterated by shell fire. Radios were unreliable and rare. And when lines went quiet, the only option was human, the runner. Runners carried written orders from battalion headquarters to companies in the forward trenches, or brought back reports under fire. They ran through open ground, shell holes, and known killing zones. They moved when others stayed low. One Edmonton soldier, Private Joseph Goldie Fairholm of the 49th, left a diary that captures the role plainly. On multiple days in 1917, he describes carrying messages under fire as routine, not heroic, just necessary. Quote, "My main duty was to run messages in the trenches. You went because you were sent." End quote. Another veteran, writing later, summarized the danger more bluntly. He said, quote, "The runner was a marked man. He had to go over the open when everyone else was hugging the mud. He carried the lives of 100 men in a leather pouch, and he ran until he got through, or he was stopped." End quote. This was not exaggeration. Runners suffered casualty rates comparable to forward assault troops. Their value made them targets. A Cree athlete from Red Pheasant First Nation in Saskatchewan, named Alexander Watney Decoteau, was one of Western Canada's greatest distance runners at a time when sport was one of the few public stages open to Indigenous excellence. Between 1909 and 1916, he dominated long-distance races across the prairies, setting records and winning trophies so frequently that many were eventually awarded to him outright. His talent carried him beyond regional competition to the world stage, where he represented Canada in the 5,000-meter event at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, becoming the only athlete from Alberta on the Canadian track team. Decoteau's public life extended beyond sport. In 1909, he joined the Edmonton Police Department, becoming Canada's first Indigenous police officer, and later one of its earliest motorcycle officers. By 1914, he'd been promoted to sergeant, a rare position of authority for an Indigenous man in early 20th century urban Canada. His presence on the force challenged prevailing assumptions about who could represent the law, even as he continued to face the constraints imposed on Indigenous people under federal policy. When Decoteau enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in April 1916, he did so as Private Alexander W. Decoteau, service number 231462. After training with the 202nd Battalion, he reinforced the 49th Battalion, Edmonton Regiment, overseas. In uniform, as in civilian life, his endurance set him apart. He was assigned the dangerous work of a battalion runner, carrying messages under fire across shattered ground, running not for medals or crowds, but because the line had to hold. Decoteau's letters home are restrained. He rarely boasts. In one, he explains simply why he enlisted. Quote, "I felt I had a loyalty to my country, and I wanted to go serve for that reason." End quote. He doesn't describe fear, and he doesn't describe glory. Like many soldiers of the time, he focuses on duty. By 1917, the 49th Battalion was fighting in the Ypres salient, ground that became synonymous with destruction. The war diary records relentless shelling, flooded trenches, and mounting exhaustion. During the Second Battle of Passchendaele, men advanced through mud so deep that wounded soldiers drowned where they fell. In this environment, runners mattered more than ever. As the Canadian Corps prepared for its final assault on the Passchendaele Ridge, the terrain itself became an adversary. The ground around First Farm, east of Ypres, had been pulverized by weeks of shellfire. Trenches dissolved into waterlogged craters, landmarks vanished, maps no longer made sense or matched the earth they claimed to represent. The 49th Battalion War Diary notes the conditions with typical understatement. Continuous shelling, exhausted men, and very heavy going in ground that offered little cover and less orientation. It was through this landscape that Private Alexander Decoteau continued his work as a battalion runner. Runners moved between companies and headquarters when all other forms of communication failed. They carried written messages by hand, often in daylight, crossing open stretches of ground that enemy snipers had already measured and memorized. The experience of that work survives in the words of Decoteau's comrades. Private Joseph Goldie Fairholm, also of the 49th, recorded in his diary the routine danger of message running earlier that same year. Quote, "My main duty was to run messages in the trenches. You had to get through. There wasn't much choice about it." End quote. By October 1917, the dangers Fairholm described had intensified. During the Canadian attacks toward Passchendaele village, runners were required to move forward repeatedly as front lines shifted and units lost contact. The war diary for the battalion during the last days of October records ongoing movement under fire and mounting casualties under the advance near First Farm. It was during this period, on October 30th, 1917, that Private Decoteau was killed. Archival records confirm that Decoteau was killed in action by a sniper's bullet while carrying out runner's duties near First Farm. He died instantly, 29 years old. His official service record lists his death as occurring during operations connected to the Second Battle of Passchendaele, one of the most costly engagements in Canadian military history. There are no dramatic last words recorded. No eyewitness account survives describing the moment itself. Like many runners, Decoteau simply didn't return. His death was one among thousands that month, yet it carried particular weight within the battalion. Decoteau was already known among the men, not only for his endurance on duty, but for the life he had lived back home before the war. An Olympic athlete, a police sergeant, a public figure whose name had once been called out over starting lines and casualty rolls. He was buried in Passchendaele New British Cemetery, overlooking ground that had cost the Canadian Corps more than 16,000 casualties in a matter of weeks. His grave marks the end of a life defined by motion, running for sport, running for duty, and finally, running because the message had to get through. In the regiment's memory, Decoteau did not die as a symbol. He died as a runner, one of the many who crossed broken ground so that others could act with knowledge rather than guesswork. In a war measured by movement and miscalculation, that quiet labor made the difference between collapse and control. Here, history and legend intertwine. Before deploying, Decoteau had continued to run in military sports meets while training in England. At one such event, He won a 5-mile race attended by King George V, who presented him with a personal gold pocket watch. This detail is well documented. What happened to the watch after his death exists in multiple versions. Some accounts claim it was taken by the German sniper who killed him. Others report it was later recovered by Canadian soldiers and sent home to Decoteau's mother. The exact sequence remains uncertain. What is certain is this. When Decoteau's body was recovered, the watch was no longer on him. His grave, overlooking reclaimed farmland near Ypres, became one of thousands. But his story continued to circulate within the regiment and beyond. Decoteau's story fits into a longer prairie history, one shaped by Louis Riel, resistance, service, and survival under state authority. Like many Indigenous soldiers, he fought for a country that had not always fought for him. His father had lived in the shadow of the 1885 resistance. Decoteau carried that history with him into uniform. Yet there is no bitterness in his letters, no manifesto, just service. Alex Decoteau didn't charge a machine gun nest. He didn't command a battalion. He ran. And in a war that killed millions by standing still, movement took courage of a particular kind. The 49th Battalion is remembered for its toughness, its refusal to break. Decoteau's life and death embody that reputation, not because of myth, but because of motion. One man, one message, crossing open ground while everything else tried to stop him. If this segment were about snipers or warriors, we might speak in numbers, but this is about runners, and runners measure impact, not in distance covered, but in whether or not the message arrives. So the story of Indigenous service in the First World War can't be reduced to moments of athletic brilliance or battlefield endurance alone. It's also a story of inheritance, of family memory, unresolved conflict, and the long shadow of events that had never truly settled. Few figures illustrate this more starkly than Patrick Riel. Patrick Riel served as a Métis soldier with the 44th Battalion, that's out of Manitoba, a unit raised largely from Winnipeg and the surrounding prairie communities. On paper, his service was unremarkable in structure. It had, enlistment, training, deployment to France. But his surname carried a weight that no service number could erase. Patrick Riel was the grandson of a cousin of Louis Riel. That connection, while distant, wasn't abstract. And I almost kind of giggled when I said that he was the grandson of a cousin of Louis Riel, because in Indigenous circles, it doesn't matter how distantly you're related. You are related, and that's all that matters. So specifically in this case, in prairie Métis communities, like in all Indigenous communities, in fact, lineage mattered not simply as genealogy, but as memory. Louis Riel had been executed for treason by the Canadian state in 1885 in Regina, Saskatchewan, only 30 years before Patrick put on a British uniform. His death was not ancient history. It was lived history, still contested and still very raw. The irony is heavy, it's almost suffocating. Patrick Riel was fighting for the same crown whose representatives had crushed the Red River Resistance of 1869-1870 and the Northwest Resistance of 1885. The same government that had denied Métis land rights, criminalized resistance, and executed a man who, to many Métis families, remained a political leader rather than a traitor. And yet, Patrick Riel enlisted. Like many Métis and First Nation men, his decision can't be reduced to loyalty or betrayal. Veterans' testimony suggests a range of motivations. There was steady pay, the promise of equality through service, whether or not that actually even came true, family pressure, adventure, or a belief, however fragile, that sacrifice might eventually earn respect.
The irony of Aboriginal soldiers fighting a war against the oppression of fascism. giving their lives for that, and coming home to face oppressive fascism.
When I come back from overseas, they wouldn't allow us to go curling, they wouldn't allow us to go golfing in this town where I was. And when you went to the show, the Indians used to have to sit on one side of the picture show, you know.
I came to have a terrific inferiority complex. I couldn't look anybody in the eye. I had my head down all the time. And I just as soon, if I did look up, I just as soon hit you person than look at them. And that's the rage in me at that time.
I used to break out in sweats. I'd be yelling. My dad finally put me in the caboose to sleep because I wake up my brothers and sisters and that. So I used to sleep out there. And the only way I could forget that is get myself stoned, really drunk. And then I'd sleep till whenever sun up. But I used to, under the bed, I used to look and there'd be a bottle there. I'd do it all over again. And I think as a result of war, a lot of the former guys that were in the war got into that,
What unites these motivations is not being naive, but being pragmatic. Indigenous soldiers entered a war that didn't resolve their past, hoping it might at least reshape their future. Patrick Rial was sent overseas in 1915, fighting in the muddy, disorienting terrain of Belgium, where the Western Front erased distinctions between farm boys, laborers, and descendants of political prisoners alike. Within his unit, his surname carried little official meaning. What mattered was reliability under fire. That reliability never went unnoticed. After Patrick Rial was killed in action in January 1916 near Messines, his commanding officer wrote to his family. The letter reflects neither political symbolism nor dramatic flourish. Instead, it reads like many frontline evaluations. It's direct, professional, and deeply admiring. Quote, "He was one of the best scouts in the battalion, a man of extraordinary bravery who was always the first to volunteer for a dangerous patrol." End quote. This was not ceremonial praise. Scouting was among the most dangerous work assigned to infantrymen. Scouts moved ahead of the line, probing enemy wire, observing troop movements, and guiding patrols through uncertain ground. Survival depended on discipline, restraint, and judgment. To be described as one of the best was to be marked as indispensable. There is no indication that Patrick Rial's service softened the Canadian state's view of the Rial legacy. His death did not resolve the arguments that followed Louis Riel to the gallows. If anything, it sharpened the contradiction. Here was a Métis man, descended from the same family that had resisted Canadian expansion, dying in service of the empire that had executed his relative. Not as a symbol and not as an exception, but as a capable, respected soldier whose loss mattered on a tactical level. Patrick Riel's story exposes a truth that sits uncomfortably alongside more heroic narratives of the war. They entered a uniform system that demanded loyalty without offering closure. In doing so, they embodied a paradox that Canada is still learning how to acknowledge. Indigenous service in the Great War was not a single story of triumph or reconciliation. It was layered, unresolved, and human, marked as much by irony as by courage. So why did a Riel fight for the crown? We don't have Patrick's private diary to tell us, but we can look to the words of other Métis veterans of the era who spoke of proving their loyalty to a country that doubted them. They weren't fighting because they'd forgotten the past. They were fighting to ensure they had a future. So the connection here is whether it was Dakota running through the gas at Passchendaele or Riel scouting the German wire, these men of the 49th and the 44th were proving that the rebel and the ward were, in fact, the most reliable soldiers the king had. This next segment takes us away from the familiar Alberta prairies and into the rugged coastlines of Labrador and the interior of British Columbia, total opposite ends of the spectrum. It highlights that Indigenous valor wasn't a regional phenomenon. It was a continent-wide contribution. So as we move into this part of the episode, it's worth pausing to remember something that often gets lost in Canadian retellings of the First World War. And that is, in 1914, Newfoundland was not yet part of Canada. It was its own self-governing dominion of the British Empire. It had its own government, economy, and military obligations. When war broke out, Newfoundland answered directly to Britain, not to the rest of Canada. And just for the record, and for those who don't know, Newfoundland did not join the rest of Canada until 1949. So this all matters because the men who joined the Newfoundland Regiment, later earning the title Royal Newfoundland Regiment, were not Canadian soldiers. They trained differently. They served under different command structures and carried a distinct identity, one shaped by isolation, seasonal labor, and a long relationship with the North Atlantic world. But once they crossed the ocean, those distinctions dissolved quickly. And another little interesting note here, if you ever have a chance to look at the attestation paperwork or the service record of a man who served in the Newfoundland Regiment, it's super interesting because it looks so completely different than an attestation paper or service record from a man who was with the CEF. It's very cool. The mud at Ypres didn't recognize Dominion status, and the shells over the Somme didn't care about passports, and neither did the war. So among the men who volunteered for the Newfoundland Regiment were Indigenous Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, including members of the Inuit and Inuit Métis communities of Labrador. They fought under a British flag, but brought with them knowledge and skills shaped far from parade squares or drill halls. One of those men was John Chiwak. John Chiwak was an Inuk hunter and trapper from Rigolette, Labrador. It was a coastal settlement at the edge of the North Atlantic, where survival depended on patience, sharp observation, and deep familiarity with the land. His pre-war life revolved around seasonal rhythms, so sealing, trapping, and traveling long distances across ice and coastal terrain. This was a world defined by quiet, attentiveness, wind on ice, the movement of animals at a distance, subtle changes in light. These were not talents that came from instinct. They were learned through years of practice and necessity, passed down through family. When Lance Corporal John Chiwak, service number 1735, Newfoundland Regiment, enlisted in 1915, he entered a military environment utterly different than anything he had ever known. He traded his civilian life first for the Ross rifle and later for a Lee Enfield, weapons designed for industrial war rather than subsistence hunting. And yet, something translated. On the Western Front, Chiwak proved himself quickly as a sniper and scout. His officers recognized that he possessed a kind of battlefield awareness that couldn't be taught easily. And over time, his reputation grew, quietly, without exaggeration in official records, but with unmistakable respect. One officer would later describe him as, quote, the best sniper in the British Army, end quote. We learn perhaps the most about Chiwak not from formal commendations, but from the words of those who knew him. Howard Nurse was a fellow soldier in the Newfoundland Regiment. He recorded his impressions of Chiwak in his diary. His description strips away heroics and leaves us with a human portrait. Quote, he was a shy, lonely man, but with a rifle in his hands, he was a wizard. He could see things in the distance that the rest of us needed binoculars for. He didn't talk much about the war. He talked about the seals and the traps back home, end quote. It's a telling observation. Nurse doesn't describe Chiwak as bloodthirsty or boastful. Instead, he emphasizes his reserve, his inwardness, and the fact that even in France, Chiwak's mental geography remained tied to the north. Where others spoke of leave, promotions, or rumors from home, Chiwak spoke of ice, animals, and distance. This balance, extraordinary effectiveness paired with personal withdrawal, was not uncommon among Indigenous soldiers assigned to scouting or sniping roles. The work demanded hours of stillness, long periods of solitude, and the ability to act decisively without supervision. For someone like Shewak, these were familiar conditions, even if the consequences were not. Shewak's own letters deepen this picture. They are plain-spoken, understated, and heavy with fatigue. In one of the most often quoted lines, he wrote to family in Labrador, quote, "I am still alive, but it is a wonder. There are many of us gone. I wish I was home in the north where it is quiet." End quote. There is no triumph there and no sense of adventure fulfilled, only survival and longing. That line about quiet is especially striking when you read against the environment in which it was written. By late 1917, the men of the Newfoundland Regiment had endured years of shell fire, gas, and relentless rotation through frontline positions. Shewak had survived Vimy Ridge, the Somme, and Ypres. The contrast between those battlefields and the northern silence he remembered could not have been sharper. In November of 1917, during the Battle of Cambrai, the war shifted again. Cambrai marked the first large-scale use of tanks by the British and represented a tactical experiment in speed and surprise. For infantrymen and snipers, it was another round of uncertainty, new weapons layered onto old dangers. It was there that John Shewak was killed by a German shell. He has no known grave. His body was never formally recovered. Instead, his name is carved into stone at the Beaumont Hamel Newfoundland Memorial, alongside hundreds of others whose remains were lost in the violence. That memorial stands today on the Somme, far from Rigolette, far from Labrador's coast. John Shewak did not return to the north he longed for. The quiet never came for him. And yet his legacy endures, not as a mythic super sniper, but as something more precise and more human. A man from the edge of the British world whose skills, shaped by ice and distance, proved decisive in a mechanized war that often erased individuality altogether. He remains one of the clearest examples of how Indigenous knowledge learned outside military doctrine was absorbed, relied upon, and rarely acknowledged fully at the time. We swing back west now to the interior of British Columbia and to the 54th Battalion, the Kootenay Regiment, a unit raised from mining towns, ranching country, and small interior communities where physical work and self-reliance were part of daily life. Here we find Private George McLean, a rancher from the Douglas Lake Okanagan First Nation, north of Merritt. McLean was born on 15 April 1875, either at Douglas Lake or Kamloops, BC, into a family deeply rooted in the interior Salish leadership. By the time he enlisted, he was 41 years old, well beyond the typical age of an infantry private, and already a veteran of the South African War, or the Boer War. McLean enlisted in Vernon, BC in October 1916. He served with the 54th Battalion, Canadian Infantry. His service number was 688302, and throughout his time overseas, his formal rank remained private, even after one of the most extraordinary acts of gallantry. During the Battle of Vimy Ridge on April 9th to 11th, 1917, McLean's company was advancing through heavily defended German positions. At one point during the fighting, his section was halted by a German machine gun nest, dug into the chalk slope and protected by barbed wire and overlapping fields of fire. Rather than wait for reinforcements, McLean went forward alone. He carried a bag of Mills bombs, hand grenades that soldiers nicknamed pineapples because of their shape. Armed only with these, McLean advanced towards the dugout under fire. The official Distinguished Conduct Medal citation, published in the London Gazette on 16 August 1917, describes what happened next in precise, restrained language. Quote, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion when dealing with enemy snipers, single-handed he captured 19 prisoners, and later, when attacked by 5 more prisoners who attempted to reach a machine gun, he was able, although wounded, to dispose of them unaided, thus saving a large number of casualties." End quote. During the action, McLean was shot repeatedly in the arm, 5 bullet wounds, Yet he refused to leave his position until the prisoners had been securely escorted back to Canadian lines. Only then did he allow himself to be evacuated. Think about that for a minute. 5 bullets in his arm, no officer present, no cover, no support, and still he got the job done. Only about 2,000 Canadians out of more than 600,000 who served in the Great War received a Distinguished Conduct Medal. Maclean received his while holding the lowest possible rank. Maclean was sent home after Vimy. His wounds ended his frontline service, but they didn't turn him into a public figure. There were newspaper interviews and brief bursts of attention, but Maclean himself never sought to build a legend. When he returned to British Columbia, he just went back to work, first as a rancher and later as a firefighter in the Vancouver area. He lived with the physical and psychological effects of Vimy for the rest of his life, dying on the 7th of September, 1934, at age 59. Unlike many decorated soldiers, Maclean never sought political office, and he never used his medal as proof of belonging or entitlement. He didn't speak often about what he had done, and when he did so plainly. So, a note here, George Maclean's story complicates easy narratives about rank, recognition, and Indigenous service. He fought as a private, acted with the independence of a seasoned officer, and was decorated at the highest level available to an NCO, yet returned home to a country that still denied Indigenous people full citizenship rights. He was not remembered because he demanded remembrance. He was remembered because others saw what he did and wrote it down. A rancher from the interior, a private with a bag of grenades, and at Vimy Ridge, a force of nature. The Great War ended on November 11th, 1918. For the survivors, the men like George Maclean and the few who remained of the 49th, the journey home was filled with a specific kind of hope. They had fought as equals. They'd been promoted, decorated, and respected. But as the troop ships docked in Halifax, many Indigenous veterans found that the Canada they left behind hadn't really changed at all. Under the Soldier Settlement Act, non-Indigenous veterans were given land and loans to start farms. But for Indigenous veterans, the government often took surplus lands from their own reserves to give to white settlers. As one veteran later remarked, quote, "We were good enough to fight for the land in France, but not good enough to own it in Canada." End quote.
Inside of a year, I got a fully furnished house, and I'm married. Now my wife's have a little baby already, 3 months old. And then came the biggest shock of my life, and one day this knock at the door, and this young man looked there, a well-dressed man, very authority voice on him. He knew who I was, he knew where I came from, and I thought to myself, he's probably from Indian Affairs. He's come to shake my hand and give me a pat in the back for doing so good for myself. And he said, "You're Wilford Brass." I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Do you know that you have this, you own your house?" "Yes, my house. I paid cash for it." "Do you know that you violated the law?" "What law?" He says, "A treaty Indian says can't own any property." Then I was a little bit annoyed because it's only 2 years since I got my discharge. So I said, "You mean to tell me that fighting for the war for this country, that I can't have no right to own property?" He said, "No, you have no right." And a couple of months later, I got this card. I was showing you about this in France. So I'm not an Indian anymore. I'm enfranchised, but I don't know what to call myself, you know. It says on there now I can vote, and I enjoy all the privileges of His Majesty's subjects, you see. So I guess, in other words, I guess I made myself a first-class citizen by doing that, but I've lost my rights as an Indian, see.
However, the spirit of these men could not be unmade. We look to Mike Mountain Horse of the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta. He served with the 191st and later the 50th Battalion alongside Henry Norwest. Mike Mountain Horse was buried alive by a shell at Cambrai and spent 4 days in a basement under fire. He survived. A decorated war hero, Mike Mountain Horse returned home in 1919, having earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his courage. He later served as an RCMP scout and created a unique historical record of his World War I experiences by painting pictographs on a traditional buffalo hide war robe, now displayed in Medicine Hat. Mountain Horse also spent the 1930s documenting his heritage in writing. His book, called My People, the Bloods, was published in 1979, after his death in 1964. That buffalo war robe that's on display in Medicine Hat shows Mike in a gas mask, German prisoners being taken, and the thunder of the guns. It's a bridge between two worlds, the ancient warrior tradition and the mechanized horror of the 20th century. He wrote of his service, quote, "The red man has always been a warrior. I went to the war because my ancestors were brave, and I wanted to show that their blood still ran in my veins." End quote. Finally, we meet Frederick Ogilvie Loft, known by his Mohawk name Onondayo, meaning beautiful mountain. He was born February 3rd, 1861, at Six Nations of the Grand River in present-day Ontario, kind of around Brantford, Toronto area. By the time the First World War was underway, Loft was already in his mid-50s, far older than the average frontline soldier, but he still chose to serve. Loft enlisted in 1917 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Canadian Forestry Corps, a vital but often overlooked branch of the CEF. Because he served as an officer, Loft didn't have a regimental service number in the same way enlisted men did, a detail that matters because it reminds us he entered the Army as a professional, not as a conscript or a laborer. The Forestry Corps sent men overseas to Britain and France to harvest timber for trenches, railways, dugouts, and military infrastructure. It was dangerous work, often carried out near the front, and it required organization, leadership, and constant coordination with British and Canadian forces. Loft saw firsthand how efficiently the military bureaucracy could function when it chose to, and how quickly men from different backgrounds could be trusted with responsibility when the situation demanded it. He also saw the contradiction forming. Indigenous men were being recruited, organized, promoted, and relied upon overseas, yet at home they remained subject to the Indian Act, denied the vote, and controlled by Indian agents. Loft understood that the war had exposed something fundamental. Canada was willing to depend on Indigenous people in a crisis, but not to recognize them as political equals. To add to this, during the First World War, Canada's residential school system was in full force, and there were hundreds of residential schools across the country. A lot of them operated in Ontario and Alberta. I think Alberta had the highest number at this time. So the children of these men who decided to sign up and fight for Canada and for the Empire, their children were in residential schools undergoing Canada's policy of cultural genocide. Just keep that in mind. When Loft returned to Canada, he concluded that the war wasn't over. It had simply changed fronts. In 1919, at the age of 58, he founded the League of Indians of Canada, the first national Indigenous political organization in the country. Drawing heavily on the experience and credibility of Indigenous veterans, the League challenged forced enfranchisement, residential schools, land seizures, and the lack of Indigenous political representation. Loft's service did not radicalize him, it clarified him. He had seen what equality looked like in uniform, and he refused to accept anything less once the uniform came off. He used the same discipline he learned in the CEF to fight the Department of Indian Affairs. He said, quote, "As we have fought for the liberty of the world, let us now fight for our own liberty and the rights of our children." End quote. The Canadian government saw him as a threat. They tried to strip him of his status, to silence him, but Loft, like the snipers and the runners, was used to being hunted. He never stopped fighting until his death in 1934. The most organized and sustained challenge to the Indian Act in the years after the First World War didn't come from Parliament or courts. It came from the veterans. And at the center of that effort stood Frederick Loft. He'd served overseas, he'd helped recruit Indigenous men for the war effort. He returned home expecting that service would count for something. What he found instead was familiar control, silencing, and familiar assumption that Indigenous people should be grateful and quiet. He refused to be either.
In Ypres, Ontario, the Stony Point First Nations lost their lands through the War Measures Act. Their land became a military base that was to be returned after the war.
We had to ask for permission to go back to the graveyards, because my mother's buried there, and there was a few of my sisters and a brother. There was trenches dug in our graveyard. Trenches, and some of the bottom stones were shot up, with rifle shots.
Among those connected to or inspired by the League of Indians of Canada were men like Francis Pegamagabo in Ontario, John Tatusis in the Prairies, Jules Siwa in Quebec, Andrew Paul on the West Coast, and Joseph Drever in Saskatchewan, combat veterans who had learned leadership overseas and were no longer willing to accept paternalism or colonialism at home. The League's demands were clear, and they were confrontational. It condemned the mistreatment of Indigenous veterans who had been denied pensions and land grants. It rejected forced enfranchisement, which demanded Indigenous people give up their legal identity under the Indian Act in exchange for basic civil rights. It openly criticized the residential school system, arguing that it destroyed communities rather than improving them. And most boldly, it demanded Indigenous political representation and self-government, something that got Louis Riel executed in 1885. They insisted that Indigenous nations had the right to speak for themselves, directly, nationally, and without permission. This was not subtle reform. It was a direct challenge to how Canada governed Indigenous people. Officials at the Department of Indian Affairs understood exactly what the League represented, and they did not welcome it. The department's longtime deputy superintendent, Duncan Campbell Scott, viewed the League as dangerous, not because it was violent, but because it was organized, articulate, and grounded in the moral authority of military service. Veterans who had survived Ypres and the Somme were difficult to dismiss as irresponsible or disloyal. Indian Affairs responded the way it often did, by trying to neutralize the leadership rather than address the grievances. Scott and his department worked to limit the League's ability to meet, communicate, and expand. They monitored its activities. They warned Indian agents to discourage participation. And most revealingly, they attempted to undermine Loft personally by pushing for his forced enfranchisement, a bureaucratic maneuver that would have stripped him of his legal status as a First Nations person and weakened his claim to represent Indigenous interests. It was an unmistakable message. Challenge the system, and the system will come for you. Importantly, this resistance was not theoretical. Indigenous veterans challenged the Indian Act in concrete, everyday ways. So they refused enfranchisement. Many veterans rejected the idea that citizenship had to come at the cost of Indigenous identity. Having fought under the Canadian flag, they saw no reason rights should require erasure. They protested land seizures. Across the country, veterans objected when reserve lands were taken or leased to settle non-Indigenous soldiers, often while Indigenous veterans themselves received marginal land or none at all. They organized politically, despite the law. Until 1951, the Indian Act restricted Indigenous political organization. Veterans ignored this. They formed leagues, councils, and regional delegations anyway, often knowing they were operating illegally. War had taught them that rules enforced unjustly were not rules that deserved obedience. And they went public. Veterans wrote letters to members of Parliament, petitions to the Crown, and submissions to government departments, again and again, They pointed out the contradiction at the heart of the system. Indigenous men trusted with rifles and lives overseas, but denied basic rights at home. It's important not to romanticize the outcome here. The Indian Act was not overturned. It's still in place today. Indigenous people did not gain the federal vote until 1960. That's 6-0. Indian affairs retained sweeping control over daily life, and many veterans paid a price for speaking out. They lost jobs, access to resources, or community support when Indian agents retaliated. The federal government's response was slow, defensive, and often hostile. Indigenous veterans were not rewarded for leadership. They were monitored, sidelined, and in some cases, deliberately worn down. But something had changed nonetheless. The war had given Indigenous veterans a language of authority, a sense of entitlement to be heard, and national connections that had not existed before. For the first time, Indigenous resistance to federal policy in Canada was not just local or regional. It was coordinated, national, and veteran-led. Fred Loft and the League of Nations of Canada did not dismantle the Indian Act. What they did was more foundational. They proved that Indigenous people could and would organize nationally. They demonstrated that military service didn't produce silence, but political awareness. And they permanently disrupted the idea that Indigenous people were passive subjects of policy rather than active challengers of it. In that sense, Indigenous veterans did not just come home from the war changed. They came home prepared to change Canada, even when Canada resisted. As we reach the end of this long episode, it's tempting to reach for resolution, to say that service led to recognition or that sacrifice finally translated into justice and everybody got their happy ending. It didn't. Indigenous soldiers went to war from communities already under constraint. They fought with distinction, often beyond expectation, under fire that did not discriminate. They bled in the same mud, carried the same weight, and buried the same friends. And they came home to a country that still didn't trust them with citizenship. That contradiction should sit very uncomfortably with us. And when I say us, I mean us of all nationalities. I myself am Métis and am very uncomfortable with this. Because what these stories reveal, whether we're talking about Pegamagabo, Dakota, Patrick Riel, John Shiwak, George McLean, or Fred Loft, it's not just courage, it's clarity. Each of them saw, in different ways, how Canada could function when people were valued for competence rather than controlled by category. The battlefield offered responsibility and home offered regulation. The war recognized ability. Peace reinstated policy. So here's the question worth lingering on. What does it say about a country when it's willing to accept sacrifice but slow to extend rights? And maybe the harder follow-up. What legacies are we still living with because of that gap? Indigenous veterans didn't ask for special treatment. They asked for equality, not symbolism, but substance. Not thanks, but trust. Some challenged the system head on, for sure. Others simply carried what they knew and lived quietly with it. Either way, their service didn't end in 1918. It continued in meetings, in protests, in letters that got ignored, in families shaped by wounds, both visible and inherited. So when we talk about remembrance, it isn't just about what happened overseas, it's about what happened afterwards. And whether remembering means more than repeating familiar stories, whether it means noticing the silences, the delays, and the choices a nation made when the uniforms came off. Because history doesn't just ask us what people did, it asks us what we did with their doing. They were men who fought for a country that didn't yet claim them. They were snipers who saw too much, runners who ran too far, and leaders who came home to a world that tried to forget them. But we haven't forgotten. Their stories are etched into the soil of Vimy, the mud of Passchendaele, and the war hide of a Blackfoot robe. They're part of our history, our Alberta heritage, and our national identity. Thank you for joining me on this very long, very deep, profound episode of Memory and Valour. I appreciate you spending the time, and until next time, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.
Kinanas kumgauna kia twagi tsirig nudun tunes. Today magi gawe hats to sky nog. We owe you so much for protecting our land. We hope that our future generations don't have to experience the same thing, to see what you saw.